In 1994, Venus Williams made her pro tennis debut at the Bank of West Classic. Now, as the family were leaving the hotel for the tournament, Venus's father, Richard Williams, noticed that Venus's dress was still hanging in the closet. And so he asked Venus, "Have you got everything, honey?" She said, "Yes, Daddy." So they left for the tournament. Now, it wasn't until they were at the registration desk that Venus realised she'd forgotten her dress, and she was, quote, mortified, and begged her father to take her back to the hotel to pick it up. And he said, no. And while she was standing next to him, he told the tournament directors to default her because she'd forgotten her dress. Now, as it turns out, the tournament directors were desperate to have Venus play. It was, all over the news that this great up-and-coming 14-year-old was making her pro debut. And so they also knew the crowds had come to see her. So they somehow got Venus's dress from the hotel, and Venus went on to win her first pro match in straight sets. But why would Richard ask tournament directors to default his daughter on her pro debut? Like, if you know nothing else about Richard Williams, it is that he spent his entire life dedicated to making sure Venus became world number one tennis champion. Like, why would he default her on her first pro match? Well, as Venus tells the story, she never forgot her outfit again. All right? For Richard Williams, it was a teaching moment. In the same way, the passage that was just read for us is a teaching moment that the disciples will never forget. You see, Jesus has just spent the entirety of Mark chapter 4 teaching people about the kingdom of God. So he started with a parable about how you get into the kingdom, and then he gives us 4 different parables about what the kingdom of God is like. And the last 2, so that's the parable of the growing seed and the parable of the mustard seed, they are about how the kingdom of God is like the juggernaut from X-Men, as we saw last week, all right? You cannot stop it. You cannot stop it. And then straight after he finishes teaching these parables, we read this, verse 35. That day, when evening came, he said to his disciples, let's go over to the other side. Now, why does Jesus finish teaching his disciples about the kingdom of God and then immediately take his disciples on a field trip? Well, it's to test them, to give them a lesson. And this lesson is on the invincibility of the kingdom. Has my teaching on the invincibility of the kingdom actually sunk in for you? Right? So Jesus puts his disciples into the middle of an actual storm in order to teach them how to face life's metaphorical storms. And that's the lesson for us today. Now, friends, if you have not experienced real suffering in life yet, it's only because you haven't lived long enough. As Rocky Balboa says, this world will beat you to your knees and keep you there if you let it. What Jesus is teaching us in this passage is how you and I can take the biggest hits this life can throw at us and keep moving forward, as Rocky says. Right? That's the lesson we're looking at today, how to face life's storms in a way that we can keep moving forward. And this lesson is based around 3 questions. Now, one of my lecturers when I was at Moore College, Peter Bolt, he wrote a book on Mark's Gospel, and he says of this passage that there are 3 unanswered questions that are asked in this passage, and these unanswered questions help us understand what Jesus is trying to teach us here. And those unanswered questions are our 3 points for today, as you can see on the inside of your news sheet. So we're going to begin with the final question. We're going to start at the end, which is, who is this Jesus? That's number 1. The second question we're going to look at is the disciples' other question, and that is when they say, "Teacher, don't you care?" It's our second point. We're then going to conclude with the question that Jesus asks, which is, do you still have no faith? And friends, if we can get a handle on these 3 unanswered questions, we will be in a better position than anyone else on the planet to be able to take those hits that life gives us and keep moving forward. So please come with me as we look at Jesus and the storm. And like I said, I want to begin at the end today with this final unanswered question, and it's in verse 41. Read it with me. It says, "They were terrified and asked each other, 'Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him.'" Now, who is this? Mark is trying to be telling us who this Jesus is, and there are various things he's taught us about Jesus so far. Number one is that Jesus is a teacher, all right? His whole ministry, since he began all the way back in Mark chapter 1, is all about teaching. Number two, he's the controller. He can perform miracles. He has complete control over demons, death, and disease. And here we actually see that he has control over the elements as well, the wind and the waves. And because Jesus can control even the wind and the waves, number three, he is the one we have to contend with. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, look, very few people today will deny that Jesus really walked the earth, all right? There is not a historian alive today who denies that Jesus didn't really exist. The evidence for the existence of Jesus is overwhelming, all right? The jury is back on that. However, not everyone believes that Jesus is who he said he was, or at least they don't live as though they believe Jesus is who he said he was. And so they think that gospel stories like this are made up. The problem is the historical evidence suggests otherwise. And with this passage, it suggests otherwise based on the useless information that Mark gives us. Now, what do I mean by useless information? I mean information that doesn't carry the story along. So I'll give you an example. In verse 36, it says, "Leaving the crowds behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat." Right? Just as he was. He didn't have a shower, he didn't have a shave, he didn't have a change of clothes, just as he was. Okay, but that doesn't really add anything to the story. Same, also in verse 36, there were also other boats with him. Now, we never hear about the boats again, those other boats again. Why is Mark telling us about these other boats? And then in verse 38, Jesus was in the stern sleeping on a cushion. Oh, isn't that nice? He's got a cushion to sleep on. Like, who cares? Why are we being told these little bits of information? Now, here's the thing. Like, Mark prides himself on an economy of words. He has just told this epic tale in just 7 verses. So why is he adding this useless information? Now, you see, modern storytelling, it loves to include details like this. Like, take Jack Reacher novels, for example. Right? Lee Child loves giving you little details. And so I remember this one scene where he's at the shooting range, the rifle range. Now, if it were me, I would say he lined up the target and pulled the trigger. Not Lee Child. No. He wants to go into the details of what it is to be a marksman. He says, he laid down, he got his elbows ready to make a tripod with the rifle, and then he took a deep breath in, and then he exhaled and held it there. And as he's sitting there holding his breath, he's listening to his heartbeat. And he's trying to get in the middle of the heartbeat. And when he's between heartbeats, he squeezes the trigger. That's the details that Lee Child gives in his stories. But in ancient stories, they didn't do that. Right? If you read some of the ancient legends like the Iliad, there are no useless bits of information. They only include the information that helps carry the story along. And so when it comes to passages like this and the cushion and the other boats and just as he was, we've only got 2 options here. Either Mark anticipated 20th century storytelling techniques that no one else followed for 2,000 years, or he's recounting an eyewitness testimony of someone who was actually there and remembered the other boats and the cushion. Now, because Mark is the earliest account we have of Jesus' life, it was in circulation at a time when most of the eyewitnesses to Jesus' life were still alive. See, all those people had to do was say, oh, actually, I was there, and I can tell you it didn't happen that way. But no one did. Evidenced by the fact that the gospel stories continued to grow and circulate and hit the whole world. Now, why is this important? Why am I bringing this up? It's because if this is a true story, as all the evidence suggests, then Jesus is not someone we can just take or leave. Right? There are many people today, there are Christians and non-Christians today, even Christians do this, who say things like, oh, look, I like what Jesus says over here, but I don't really like what he says over there, so I'm going to ignore that bit. See, what this passage says is, who cares what you think? You're not dealing with an ethics lecturer here that you can debate with. You are dealing with someone who controls the creation. And you simply cannot be casual about such a person. And so our first piece of application for today is understand there is no negotiating when it comes to Jesus. Right? If we're going to trust him to help us weather the storms of our life, that's what this passage is about, all right? If we're going to trust him with that, then we first need to understand who this Jesus is. He is not someone we can negotiate with. He is the one whom even the wind and the waves obey him. So, that's who Jesus is. Second question we need to ask is, why does Jesus let his disciples experience this life-threatening situation? Now, by life-threatening, I don't mean the boat trip. Most of the disciples were experienced fishermen. They'd been on the Sea of Galilee many times, and they'd probably been in one of those storms. You see, the Sea of Galilee, you need to understand about this, is it's located about 200 metres below sea level. But about 50 kilometres away is Mount Hermon, which is 3,000 metres above sea level. And when the cold air from Mount Hermon mixes with the warm sea air, you often get these big storms. Right? And these fishermen would have been used to those storms. But there are two things about this storm that make it different from the typical Sea of Galilee storm. And the first is it's got these seasoned fishermen terrified. Now, the NIV calls it a furious squall. That's a pretty good definition. In the Greek, it's literally a storm with mega winds. Right? A storm with mega winds. It is a huge storm. But the second thing is that Jesus leaves his disciples to deal with it themselves. Right? So as the boat is being tossed back and forth by these mega winds, and as the water is pouring in faster than the poor disciples can bail it out, where's Jesus? He is asleep. Now, how do you sleep through something like that? Well, the reason Jesus is asleep is because he has orchestrated this situation as a teaching moment. Right, like I said at the beginning, Jesus is teaching his disciples a lesson they will not quickly forget. And that lesson comes in the middle verse of our passage of this episode. So if you notice, in verses 35, 36, and 37, Mark sets up this life-threatening situation with the disciples. And then in verse 39 and 40 and 41, we see how Jesus quickly rectifies this disaster. Verse 38 is the middle verse. And it is this verse is the key to what Jesus is trying to teach them. So read it with me, verse 38. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" Now, the NIV uses the word drown there. In the Greek, it's actually even more forceful. The literal translation is, "Teacher, don't you care that we are being destroyed?" So it's the word destroyed, but it's in the present. They're not saying we might drown. The disciples are saying we are currently, as I speak, we are currently being destroyed. Now, brothers and sisters, how many of us have uttered words like this to God in our life? I know I have. God has actually brought some significant difficulties into my life over the last 10 years or so. Now, they're not life-threatening, but I've had those moments where I have felt that my whole life is being destroyed. And they're still going on. Right? How many of us have suffered things like reputational damage, losing your job, being diagnosed with cancer, relationship breakdown, or the death of a loved one? Right? How many of us have cried out, "Teacher, don't you care?" Now, what I want us to understand is I'm not trying to interpret this passage allegorically. I'm not saying this storm represents our difficulties in life. What I'm saying is God brought a particular difficulty into the lives of the disciples here, and that was an actual storm. In the same way, God brings difficulties into our lives. Now, they probably won't be an actual storm, right? They will be things like health problems, financial problems, relational problems, or mental health problems. And when he brings those hardships, those metaphorical storms into our lives, we too are tempted to say, "Teacher, don't you care?" Now, friends, when we get to that point, when we find ourselves crying out, "Lord, don't you care?" This is the lesson we need, this passage. Right? Because the lesson Jesus is teaching the 12 here is the exact same lesson that he teaches all of us when we are going through difficult times in life. And that lesson is in verse 40. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" Now notice, Jesus does not say, "Oh, look, I understand this situation is difficult and I understand your anxiety through it." He just rebukes them. Why do you still have no faith? And why are they afraid? Now, their fear can only be one of two reasons. Right? There's only one of two reasons why these disciples are afraid at this point. Either they think Jesus is not able to help them, or they think Jesus is not willing to help them. And that's the same with every single human heart when we go through difficulties. We will either conclude God is not all-powerful because he's not able to help me, or God is not all-loving because he's not willing to help me. Now, the disciples already know that Jesus can do both those things. They've seen it time and time again. They've seen Jesus drive out demons in Mark chapter 1. They've seen Jesus heal all manner of diseases in Mark chapter 1. They've seen Jesus help a paralyzed man walk again, Mark chapter 2. And they've seen a man with a shriveled hand healed immediately, Mark chapter 3. So they have experienced Jesus' overwhelming power firsthand. They know he's powerful enough. And they know that every time Jesus uses that miraculous power, he's using it to help people. They know he's loving. The problem is they don't know how to hold those two facts together when hardship comes. And that's often our problem as well. And this is why Jesus rebukes them. He says, your whole premise is wrong. The lesson Jesus is trying to teach us here is, I can love someone and still let them go through a storm. Do we believe that, friends? Do we have that faith? Now, he shows us this first by making it clear that this storm is within his control. All right? We see by the fact that he just speaks to it. The great evangelist John Chapman used to say, if you don't believe in Jesus' power here, then why not try it yourself, right? Get on a Manly ferry on a stormy day, and as you're out in the middle crossing the heads, just stand up and tell the wind and the waves to be quiet. You know, he used to suggest do it up the back so no one sees you when you fail. But that's what Jesus is doing here. He's speaking to the storm. And he only uses two words in the Greek. So the equivalent is, this is what Jesus says in English. He says, be quiet and stay quiet. It's the kind of thing you would say to unruly little kids, isn't it? And Jesus says it to a hurricane. Right? He has unlimited power. And what we're told is it goes from mega winds to literally a mega calm. In verse 39 it says, then the wind died down and it was completely calm, literally mega calm. Now, why the two descriptions here? It sounds a little redundant, doesn't it? The wind died down and it was completely calm. Well, Mark is also telling us that not only did the mega winds disappear in an instant, but the waves also disappeared in an instant. Now, if you've ever been at the beach when there's been a storm, you'll know it takes about 5 to 10 hours for the waves to calm down. But with just two words from Jesus, that storm of mega winds turned into a mega calm, showing this storm is within Jesus' control. Right? He's powerful enough. We know that. But this miracle doesn't just show Jesus' power, it also shows his goodness. And I don't mean that he saved the disciples from a storm. What I mean is this episode recalls another storm in the Bible. In Jonah chapter 1, the prophet Jonah forgot God's power and his goodness, and he tried to run away from God. And God sent an actual storm to Jonah to teach him a lesson. And these two storms are almost identical in every way, all right? So both storms are unusually fierce. The sailors are absolutely terrified by these storms, all right? The kind of storm they've never been stuck in before. In both cases, the protagonist is asleep as the storm tears the ship apart. In both cases, the sailors come to wake the main character of the story and beg him for help. And in both cases, the sailors are even more terrified after the storm is calmed than they were by the actual storm. There's only one real difference with the story of Jonah and the whale compared to the story of Jesus and the storm, and that is that Jonah told the sailors that he needed to be sacrificed in order for the sailors to be saved. And so at Jonah's request, the sailors threw Jonah overboard. They threw him into the storm, causing the wind and the waves to die down instantly. Jesus, on the other hand, was not thrown into the storm to save the disciples. Or was he? Because you see, if we take a step back from this passage, we realise Jesus was thrown into the perfect storm. Not a storm of mega winds, but the storm of God's wrath. See, to save the disciples from being destroyed by the sea, Jesus only had to speak 2 words. But to save his disciples from being destroyed for our sin, Jesus couldn't just speak. He had to act and take on the punishment for our sin himself on the cross. He had to be destroyed at the cross. And the cross is the ultimate example of God loving someone and still allowing them to go through the storm. And that's the lesson that Jesus wants his disciples to never forget, right? It's not make sure you always got your tennis dress before you leave. It is understand that I can love someone and still allow them to go through storms. So the final question we need to ask is, how do we apply this to our lives? Like this is the lesson that Jesus is trying to teach us. How do we make this lesson sink in? Well, there are 3 things I want to share with us by way of application as we close. And the first is to realise that God sends hardships to test us. Now, that's not the only reason he sends hardships. All right? There are various reasons in the Bible given for why suffering happens in this world. But Romans 8:28 says God uses all things to bring about the good for those who love him. And so when we are going through suffering, we need to know, we need to understand, we need to remember that God is using those hardships to bring about good for us. And quite often it will be a test. All right? But here's the thing. In order to test us, he has to put us out of our depth. See, if you give a year 12 student an exam from year 6, it's not really a test, is it? They're not out of their depth. Right? To be able to test us and give us lessons in life, he has to throw us into the middle of an ocean in the middle of a storm. We need to be out of control. So next time we are feeling that our lives are out of control, don't you care, Lord? Step number 1 is to remember that time where the disciples were out of control. And remember the lesson Jesus was trying to teach them. That's step 1. Step 2 is we need to take a breath. And I mean this quite literally. We need to stop, sit down, and breathe in through our nose and out through our mouth. Right? Psychologists actually tell us that when we do this, breathe in through our nose, out through our mouth, do that 3 times, the oxygen actually allows us to calm down a bit and get a level head. Right? The disciples did not have a level head. They were running around in a tiz. That's what the disciples needed. They needed a level head. What they needed was Psalm 46 verse 10. Linda actually reminded me of this week. Psalm 46 verse 10 says this: "Be still and know that I am God." All right, so step 2, sit, take a deep breath, and get a level head. And then when you've got that level head, step 3 is to remember that he is God. All right? Now, what does that mean? It means to remember that God is infinitely powerful and infinitely loving. So infinitely powerful, right? Do you think that calming a little storm on a planet that is orbiting one of 400 billion stars, and that's just the Milky Way galaxy, and the Milky Way galaxy is one of over 2 trillion galaxies in the known universe, do you think that if he can just calm that little storm, which just like that, don't you think he can handle your issues as well? But second, when we remember Jesus bowing his head into the ultimate storm to take care of our biggest problem, then we can trust that he will use whatever situation we're going through for our good as well. And that's what helps us keep moving forward when suffering comes our way. Right? We remind ourselves each and every day the God who created the heavens is in complete control of this. But we also remind ourselves that the God who went to the cross for us will continue to look after our issues when they're a little smaller than that. He has given us overwhelming evidence of those two things, friends. So next time things happen, stop, take a breath, and get a level head and say, look, I'm not going to fret or complain about these things. This is a test that God has sent my way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get on with the job of serving him. Yes, the difficulties are coming. Yes, it feels bad. But I'm going to trust that God is sorting that out. That's his job. My job is to try and learn from that. Now, we may never know what the test is. I mean, that's the whole point of a test. If you knew what was coming in the test, it's not really a test. You're not out of your depth. We may never know what it is. But our job is to get on with serving the Lord in our life. So, friends, I pray you're looking forward to your next test so you can put this into practice. All right? Understand, God can still love someone and let them go through a storm. So next time we're in a storm, let us be still and know that he is God.